So can you hear me now? Hello? Okay, cool. All right. So I was saying hello, everybody. So you haven't missed. Uh, welcome to the lecture. If you haven't already, please can you please turn on your cameras? So yeah, the system has been the whole audio thing with Zoom is getting more complicated because now you can commute the audio um, from the preferences and not from the mute button at the bottom. So yeah, and I've figured out a way. When you play videos, it doesn't play the sound for the viewers. So there's a way to make it as such, but then it complicates things when you actually want to speak. So that's good. I hope you're all doing fine. Um, One thing that I've kind of been feeling this week, it feels like for some reason, it feels like this semester uh, has has been going on for a full year. It's just there's no difference in semesters anymore, like in the way you feel them, right? So it's as if we've been doing this for the whole time, and I forgot how a regular classroom looks like. So I've been having that feeling as of late. Uh, yeah, unfortunately, I'm seeing some people nodding, which is sad. Uh, anyhow, right. So let me share the screen and do something useful. Um, okay, actually, it's not the. Why is it? There you go. All right. So today we're going to talk about types of claims in research. Um, so last week we talked about the different paradigms. If you remember, we talked about three paradigms. Um, we talked about the empirical paradigm, of quantitative social science paradigm. We talked about the interpretive paradigm, and we talked about the critical paradigm. And we mentioned that within the empirical paradigm, the basic belief or the basic assumption is that objective reality is real, and that this objective reality can be explored, explained, and interpreted by the researchers. And that interpretation and exploration follows that there are certain procedures that the researcher must follow in order to establish those objective facts. Um, and it then follows as well that the role of scientists or the role of researchers is to provide explanations about reality without necessarily changing them. So there is an idea that you can look at natural as well as social phenomena and then reduce them to their most basic components and then explaining the relationship between these components. And so that's the part that we're going to continue with. What type of claims does empirical research do? So we're going to talk about exploratory claims, explanatory claims, and predictive claims. And on Friday, we're going to talk about inductive and deductive reasoning and establishing causality in. So, and so in empirical research, and this is because we said what this class is going to follow is like the empirical paradigm. We have different type of claims we make when we do research. We have exploratory claims, we have explanatory claims, and we have predictive claims. And I'm going to explain each one of them. So what does the word the word exploring, what does it mean? Could someone tell me what does explore means? to them?
It sort of means you're trying to like experience something new and come away with like new understandings of it.
Right. To experience something new. So explore San Diego, or when you say explore California, the first thing that comes to mind is like you would explore new places in California, right? Or when you say I'm just exploring, that means you probably went to a new place and you're just exploring, like I'm just looking around. I'm not looking for something specific. I'm just exploring, right? So exploratory research is similar to that notion, which is that it's the type of research that want to gain insights into a new topic. So you're exploring, let's say, social media habits, or how students are adapting to the new environment or the new nature of remote or online education or online learning. You're exploring the effects of COVID-19 on the hospitalization capacities in Southern California. You're exploring how the COVID crisis has affected enrollment in medical school or medical training. So you would explore some facts that you want to gain new insights into. And then you have explanatory claims or explanatory research. And that's the part of research where you aim to explain a relationship between variables. So you can find in a research, for instance, that professors' productivity has went down through since has been going down since March of 2020. And then if you figure out what happened in March 2020, we started to have a series of stay-at-home orders and lockdowns and the unprecedented disruption into the nature of work. So you want to explain how that affected the productivity of professors. So was it like time spent online, just the fatigue, or like lose of time for preparation? All of these things could explain why professors' productivity went down uh, since the COVID crisis started, right? So that's what we call explanatory. You explain why a relationship exists between two or more variables. And then with predictive research is similar to explanatory research is that you propose what happens when you introduce a new variable or when you change a new variable, you can predict what will happen to another variable. Uh, and so one classic example that you predict that if a certain percentage take the vaccine, the infection rate will go down a certain percentage. So that's you introduce a new treatment or a new variable, and then you predict changes. If you want an example from our field, the communication field, so the prediction is introducing interactive ads into social media, which actually increases consumers' engagement with the brand. So the idea is, if you see, if you're on Snapchat, let's say, and probably you've seen one of these before, some ads that you can actually touch and click some things, and it looks like a game and feels like a game, right? Uh, and so it has some interactive features, and you would predict that if you introduce that, uh, engagement with that post would increase by a certain percentage. So we call that predictive research. A changes induced into one variable would predict differences in another variable. So let's go deeper into details one by one. So with exploratory research, so exploratory research, you're interested in establishing some facts and identifying key variables. You will basically, what researchers would do is that they will pick one topic, one general topic, and then try to make an observation or paint a broad picture of what the situation looks like. Usually with exploratory research, you don't have a specific hypothesis. Actually, you never have a specific hypothesis, but you always have research questions, right? Um, I want to know, for instance, um, what are your habits when you stream movies online? So do you prefer, if I'm running a survey about uh, how Generation Z, that's you or digital natives, uh, use or streaming services? So do you prefer to watch shows alone or with a group of friends? If it's both, what type of shows you prefer to watch alone versus the group of friends? What other activities you do? Do you cook while you're watching, while you're playing something on Netflix? Do you do homework? I will just have a large topic and I want to explore what the situation is, how like my population of interest is dealing with a specific situation. So it's mostly about the initial questions you have when you're doing research. Um, is not linked to measuring exactly specific things. So you don't have to have measurable variables or scales. You can have some observational or qualitative studies if you're coming up, if you want to produce exploratory claims. Uh, so for that sense, exploratory research is mostly useful for new topics, for topics that have been under investigated. So I don't know anything yet about how do young people nowadays watch Netflix or deal with Netflix. I can start just with a broad topic about like asking students in general what they do. And from that, I can then produce or build upon that. I can have new studies that will look into more explanations, right? And so, for instance, if I find that females and males use Netflix differently, what would be the explanation of that? Right? So, uh, like, can we link into like some type of shows or like some general preferences in females towards specific characters? And then I can then propose a new explanatory study that focus on explaining that specific relationship. So I would have a very specific research question that I took from an exploratory research, and then I apply it into an explanatory research. Right? So I hope that's clear. Um, and so yeah, exploratory research is always helpful to guide new research, and it only provides descriptive data and not necessarily inferential data. So descriptive data, what we mean by that is just showing number attached to one variable. So that like let's say let's stick with Netflix, uh, like such and such percentage watch Netflix on mobile versus iPad versus uh, laptop versus air streaming into TV, larger TV screen, right? And like that percentage of like that show, most of the watchers coming from these different geographic locations, right? So just describing what's happening. So an example of exploratory research is like if you're talking about COVID death rates across ethnic groups. So this is direct quote from the study of this by the CDC. Of the analyzed deaths for which race and ethnicity have been reported, 21% were Black and 22% were Hispanic. Uh, Keeping in mind that Black Americans are 12% and Hispanics are 17% of the population. So, and you can see the Black and Latino coronavirus cases. So why do we consider this research to be, or this claim that I've quoted here, to be exploratory only? Why is it only exploratory?
Because it's not really explaining anything. It's just laying out numbers.
What is the thing that is not explained in this statement or in this study?
It doesn't explain why the cases are higher in Black and Latino communities versus white communities.
Right. So that's exactly right. If there's no explanation, it's not an explanatory study. So yeah, so it is just, as I said, describing what the numbers are. So here's the percentage of this we see among Blacks or within the Black community and within the Latino community. But we cannot say, at least as far as this study goes, we cannot say what exactly the reason is, right? So you just look at these numbers and you want to understand why. So you got the what question answered, but then the why question. What could then be some explanation for this, uh, uh, for these numbers? What could be some plausible explanation that we might investigate?
You could say that the like structural inequalities like in the healthcare system are disproportionately affecting Black and Hispanic populations.
Right. And so by structural inequalities, you mean what specifically?
Just like systemic racism and like racism in the healthcare system, where like people from minority ethnic groups aren't always able to receive the same like standard of care as their white counterparts, depending on location and depending on quality of health communication.
Right. So the idea, so one explanation could be that the type of quality care that white Americans get is not matched to the type of care that Blacks and Latinos get in the healthcare system. So that's one explanation, right? Uh, what could be then another explanation or an added explanation aside from that? So something about, I don't know, exposure or things like that. What could be another explanation?
I would say that like members of minority ethnic populations tend to comprise more of like frontline workers and essential workers during the pandemic.
Right. So another explanation would be that because a higher percentage or a higher proportion of Black and Hispanic, Black and Hispanic population are into the frontline workers or essential worker categories, they don't have the ability to quarantine as much as the different other groups. And so for you would see a higher rate of cases and a higher rate of death among the Black and Hispanic population, right? Um, are those two claims or two explanations we just came up with, or Lily came up with, are they testable or not? Are they testable claims? Yes, no. Let me ask it another way. If the claim is there's a disparity in healthcare access between Black Americans and white Americans or Caucasians, can I test that claim? Can I find out what is it, what it is, right? Yeah. So yeah. So the idea is once I see findings from an exploratory studies, I would automatically come up with different explanations into why, but those explanations have to be testable. And here comes the role of explanatory research. It's like I test the relationship between two variables or more. So I see a relationship between uh, being black and or Hispanic and a higher chance of dying from COVID. And then I'll come up with an explanation. So I tested it. I come up with an explanation. And so those type of explanatory research, the explanatory claims always rely on and must have some specific and measurable variables. So with exploratory research, I can look into the COVID situation in general and I produce different numbers. When you have an explanatory claim, you're explaining, you take then a few variables very specified that are measurable and say, okay, I'm going to explain the relationship amongst them or relationship among them, right? And so we explanatory research, so exploratory research is only produces descriptions. You describe the reality, you show the different numbers of whatever topic you're studying, whereas explanatory research, you do inference or you produce inferential data. And so from information gathered, the raw data that you gathered, you can infer some explanations by running either statistical tests and or some logical conclusions. And so going back to the claim that I made, so so if the explanation is that, so let's say African Americans, there's inequities related to African Americans' access to healthcare or health insurance coverage, I can actually look at the numbers. Right? So we can say we are part of the government, we can get that data. I can look into the percentages of African Americans covered, and then what proportion is that is represented the COVID deaths. And I can see then that as much coverage or medical coverage goes up, the COVID deaths go down, right? And so I can see the proportionality of that. And then the proportionality in healthcare coverage matches the proportionality in COVID deaths. And since that would be my logical explanation, since those proportionalities match up, I can see this is the most logical explanation for the phenomenon or the disparity that we're seeing, right? So, there is a relationship exists between two variables, and then I provide the mechanism that explain that link. So with explanatory research, you have to have more than one variable, right? So this one predictor, one outcome, or like two correlated variables. And then it is what, if you remember what we said about theory, so theory always means that you have an explained relationship between two. So some general principle that guides whatever changes you see. So if you say healthcare coverage, then that healthcare coverage, so your theory is whenever healthcare coverage extends, inequities in death and infection will go down. So that's your general theory, right, about the matter. And so, yes, we would use explanatory and predictive research for the research projects that want to advance or support certain theories that are testable. The only difference between exploratory and predictive research, so they are very similar, but the only difference is that about manipulating, if you're manipulating one variable or another experimentally. So explanatory research explains the relationship between two existing conditions without any change induced or experimented by the researcher. So for instance, you want to explain the relationship between satisfaction with online learning and time spent like time spent on group activities. And so you might find that the more group activities people engage in, the more satisfied uh, people are with online learning. If you just do a survey, so you're saying, okay, the more people, the people who reported more engagement in group activities also reported high satisfaction, that becomes explanatory. Whereas if you induce it, so let's say, for instance, I introduced a new cooperative game into one section of my classes, but the other section of my classes stay the same. And then I just gather data from now until 2 months from now, and then compare the results. What I did is that I introduced a new variable, right, which is playing cooperative games. And based on that variable that I manipulated between the two groups, I am expecting a change in the outcome, whether it's being satisfaction, or learning attainment or whatnot. That will then be a predictive. Okay? If I introduce games, people will like the class more. That's a predictive statement, and it has always been linked to experimental manipulation. So I hope that point made sense. So if you're manipulating something, it's predictive. If not, it's explanatory. So this is an example of explanatory research. So getting good quality sleep, exercising, and eating more raw fruits and vegetables improve mental health and well-being. The study surveyed more than 1,100 young adults from New Zealand about the sleep, physical activity, diet, etc., and some outcome measure of depressive symptoms and well-being. And the results showed that the sleep quality was the strongest predictor of depressive symptoms and well-being. So having more quality sleep produces less or protects you from depressive symptoms and increases your subjective well-being. Right? So that's one example of explanatory research. I'm only giving you that one, but the research went on to explain the process. So what type of components your brain produces when you go into better sleep, and that would explain the protection against depressive symptoms. So this is one example. Here is an example of a predictive research. So researchers found that a one-time single-dose treatment of psilocybin, which is a compound found in psychedelic mushrooms, combined with psychotherapy, appears to be associated with significant improvements in emotional and existential distress in cancer patients. So this is an actual experiment conducted by medical researchers. And so they gave cancer patients, a single dose of that compound, and 5 years later, so this was a longitudinal studies. 5 years later, they measured the level of distress among those cancer patients as compared to patients who did not take the drug. And they found that people who took the drug 5 years ago were more satisfied and were more mentally healthy than people who did not take the drug 5 years ago. So that linger effect was produced by manipulating that specific variable, which is taking the magic mushrooms compound. So yeah, and so those type of claims. Then, so I hope you're understanding. So now, what type of claims the research makes? So are you just exploring or just describing reality? Are you explaining relationship, or are you predicting a new change? Based on what you want to do, the design of your study would be different, or the type of studies would be different. And so if you're looking for exploratory findings, you just have some general research questions. You would mostly then do observational studies. The observational studies, again, is like when you just capture reality at one point in time. So it's similar to if you're a zoologist, go out in the jungle and you observe elephants. You're describing different organs of the elephant, the structure, the family structure in elephant communities, the diet habits of elephants, what regions do elephants roam in, how the environment is changing. So you're just exploring what's happening with and to elephants. Whereas if you're making inferential claims, that is to say, explanatory and predictive, you have to follow by either longitudinal studies or experimental studies. So longitudinal studies, you measure effects across time. So if I'm interested in the effects of climate change on the elephant habitat, so I could have a specific research question about access to water. So I can have a longitudinal study. So I see how the water levels changes and the consumption of water by elephants, and how is that affecting their behavior? So are they becoming more aggressive? Do we see a decrease in, let's say, fertility rates among elephants? So you can ascribe the decline in fertility rates among elephants to the loss of access to water because of climate change effects. So that's an explanation of one phenomena by an observed variable. Whereas if you're running, let's say, an experimental study, so you can give elephants water, or you can give elephants certain, you can change their diet somewhat, or you move them from one environment to another and see what will change. So that will be predictive research. You have some hypothesis, and you're saying, if we introduce this treatment to the situation, the outcome will change. So is this point clear so far? Okay. And so Libby then run this exercise. So can you please tell me if this is exploratory, explanatory, or predictive? So the topic is social media use and effective well-being. So this is an actual study. I did not make this up. So participants were randomly assigned to 5 conditions: no change in social media use, or absence from social media use for 1, 2, 3, or 4 weeks. Results: abstinence from social media, increased time spent engaged in 7 activities, primarily browsing the internet, working, childcare, and cooking, cleaning. On days participants used social media, minutes of use were negative associated with quality of day. So you understand what that means? So the more you use social media, or the more people use social media, the more they rated their day negatively. Okay? And time spent working, sleeping, cooking were also negatively associated with effective well-being and quality of day. Right? So the question is this claim made, or are these results exploratory, explanatory, or predictive?
Would that be predictive, since they were manipulating the variable by like assigning them to different conditions?
Right. That's predictive. So since they assigned them into different conditions, they were expecting that they would see different outcomes based on which conditions the participants were assigned to, right? And so the hypothesis was, although I did not type it in here, but the hypothesis was like the more people use social media, the more negative their reported effective well-being will be, right? So my question is, assuming they were not assigned to different conditions, and then you just measure, you just run a similar survey, but you just measured how many hours do people spend on social media and their effective well-being. What the research then will be: exploratory, explanatory, or predictive?
It would be explanatory because you're explaining the relationship between the two variables of social media use and effective well-being, but you're not manipulating anything.
Right, because there's no manipulation. You're just saying that, yeah, our spend on social media would be associated with negative affective well-being. So negative affective well-being is explained by our social media. If you have that hypothesis, yes. If you're just running, if you're coming with a research question and you're just exploring different social media uses and then you found that correlation, it would actually be even exploratory because you didn't have a hypothesis, right? Once you can actually provide explanations to why, then yeah, it become explanatory. Let me then ask you a similar question to what I've asked before. Why do you think this is? So there is an association between hours, minutes used on social media and how you rate your quality of stay. Why do you think that is the case? What would explain that? Any guesses? Like there's no right or wrong answers in here.
So the question you're asking is, why would there be a negative association with social media use?
Yeah, well, there is a negative, at least according to this study, there is a negative correlation, but then why? What could explain that?
Maybe it's screen time's like effect on the brain. Like it makes you feel more tired and less engaged in the actual world around you.
Okay, so you're saying it's mostly about screening time, right? Then what? Yeah, then what if I assign people to spend the same screen time, but one group will do social media and the other group will never do social media, but the same amount of screen time. Do you expect to see the same results on hating your day or not? Well, you're saying no. So you don't predict your hypothesis to be true. But yeah, like let me ask you, okay, let me ask you very simply, again, there's no right or wrong answer. In the days that you use social media, right? Okay, I'm sure all of you have or use social media to some extent, right? But on the days that you use social media, or like the time you use social media, what do you hate about it the most? Do you come up with like a few examples, like the things in social media that make you hate your day?
I mean, I think one example could be like comparing your life to like other people's lives and that unhealthy comparison mindset or like fear of missing out, that whole thing.
Yeah. So yeah, ML is pointing to social comparison. I actually done some studies on that. So social comparison increases dissatisfaction. That's one hypothesis then. And then we can test that hypothesis by making people do social media without engaging in social comparison, which would be very difficult. Like, how are you going to control for that? But then for people who express that for people who express that they're engaging in social comparison, we should see more negative results. And people on social media who do social comparison less, we should see less negative results. If social comparison is the explanatory, right? And so from here, we could say then studies like this provide you with the ability that you would come up then with different explanation, and then you test it in follow-up steps. So that's what I want to show. Here is actually, let's wait. So okay, so we have here, so continue with the exercise. Sorry, the slides were disordered. So here's another research finding. So explanatory exploratory or method. So Asian adolescents of the mid 2010s, that's you guys, reported spending less time with their friends in person across a variety of contexts, including getting together, socializing, going out, going to movies, riding a car, shopping malls, dating, going out, as compared to adolescents in the 1970s. Is this statement exploratory, explanatory, or predictive?
Would it be exploratory because they're not saying why?
Right. If there's no explanation, it's not explanatory. So it's just showing that trend. Like, actually, kids those days they go out as much as their parents or grandparents used to do. What could be the reason, I wonder? What could be the reason that uh, teenagers those days don't go out as much?
There are a
What has
lot more.
changed? Yeah,
There are a
right,
lot.
go ahead.
Yeah, there are a lot more things that you can do by yourself than there
Right.
were in the 1970s.
Right, right. So there were no internet in the 1970s. The TV had, I think, only 3 channels. There were no videos, actually, or at least very few people could have afford like the VHS devices. So yeah, but kids nowadays, like, you have a lot of options to spend your time by yourself. Games, computers, social media, and even dating, right? Online. So here, exploratory, predictive, explanatory. Is affectionate communication heritable? So this is an actual study. So 464 pairs of twins were used for the experiment to study inheritability. The pairs answered the survey that measured trait expressed affection and trait received affection. So the affectionate style of communication in terms of like receiving and sending, reception and sending. The study's result concluded that expressed affection is attributable to unique environmental factors, whereas receiving affection, about 21% of the received affection trait is because of genetics, and 79% due to common and unique environmental factors. So is this exploratory, explanatory, or predictive?
I think it would be explanatory because it's measured by a survey and there are no variables like being manipulated.
Right. And it's explanatory because, as opposed to exploratory, because what?
Because it makes a claim. There's an explanation.
Yeah, there's an explanation. So if you have a more affectionate communication, it's 21% explained by genetics and 79% explained by unique environments. So let me explain. It's a complicated study, but let me explain the premise of it. they're using twins to study inheritability, which is very common. So the idea is, so let's make it very simple. So let's say this thing stands for friendliness, all right? So if friendliness was genetic, then twins should be what? Should be equal in which trait that I just said?
Friendliness.
Right. So if it's genetic, then yeah, if your twin brother or sister is friendly, you'll be friendly. If it's environmental, so if it's 100% environmental, then you won't see that correlation, right? So you could be friendly, your twin brother could be super aggressive or non-friendly. Okay, but here's the trick. If we found that twin brothers and twin siblings match each other on friendliness more than non-twin siblings match each other, then part of it has to be genetics, right? Think about it. So if you think friendliness is due to environmental factors, so it won't be we won't see a difference between twins and non-twins. Because if your parents are friendly and you grew up in a friendly environment, you'll become friendly. But if you're in a friendly environment with other siblings, you should see similarity. But then if it's part of it is genetics, you would share more with your twin siblings than with your other brothers and sisters. So you see how you understand how they measured like 21% genetics and 79% environmental. So they would see that yes, in good environment you would see affectionate communication, but it increases by a volume of 21% when we see it matches their genes with their twins. So it's actually you would see a correlation there as well. I'm not sure if I explained it well, but twin studies have been used a lot to explain heritability because you can control for the environmental factors. When you compare twin siblings to non-twin siblings, if it's only about the environment, there should be no difference between twins and non-twins. If there is an effect of genetics, you would actually see an effect of you would see more matching between the twins as opposed to their other non-twin siblings. So that's one way of testing this type of thing. So going back, so in summary, so we explained what exploratory research is. So it's aimed to describe reality, not to explain its truth. It mostly answers the what question and is tied to observational research. Explanatory studies aim to explain causes and roots of existing realities. So hence it answers the why and how questions, how X changes Y. And it's tied to theory testing, and use a theory to explain why a relationship exists. So theory is an explained relationship, as we said before. Whereas predictive is also similar to explanatory plus. It aims to predict what will happen when you change something. So what will happen, based on changes that you induce into X, you can predict what will happen to Y. Hence, it's mostly tied to experimental research. So that's it. Do you have any questions? All right. So you don't, then enjoy the rest of your day, and I hope to see you next time. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.